Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms and I sort out how the 2024 election will impact gun policy. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective. And of course, you can buy a membership if you want to help support our independent reporting and get access to exclusive pieces you won't find anywhere else. This week, we are doing our first election reaction show. And to do that, I brought on my good friend and one of the best, smartest people in gun media, Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms. We're just going to do, a preliminary reaction. We don't have the full results yet, but we have a pretty good picture of where things are going to end up. It's kind of interesting. But before we get into that, welcome back to the show, Cam. Thanks for coming on. Tell people a little bit about yourself. Anyone who at this point who doesn't know who you are.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite, as always. I love getting a chance to come on the podcast. So, I'm the editor at bearingarms.com, host of the Cam and Company podcast. Been doing this for about 20 years or so. So I think I started covering the Second Amendment full time in the 2004 election cycle. So, I've seen a number of these elections, and this is an interesting one. It's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next couple of years.
Yeah, So again, preliminary results. We don't actually know the full makeup of government yet because it's probably going to take another week or two to get the absolute full results, because some of these states will accept ballots that are postmarked by election day but don't come in until like a week later, and that might matter in some of these races. Some of them are going to go to recounts. In fact, one of the sort of bellwether gun races, Jared Golden's reelection up in Maine, looks like it's going to a recount. He's ahead, but that's probably going to be in a recount as well. So, we're not going to have probably the full understanding of exactly how many seats Republicans got in the House or the Senate. It's right now, it's clear that Trump won, right? That much is pretty obvious. And he swept all the battleground states. Not by huge margins. He was closer there than in a lot of the swing in most other states towards Trump's. So, it's interesting. It did still end up being fairly close, but it was something where the result was pretty clear by the end of election night, and is only going to be, there's still millions of votes to count, but they're not going to change the outcome. Whereas the Senate, you're going to have a Republican majority. That's clear. The Republicans picked up the red state seats that they needed to from the incumbent Democrats in Ohio and Montana. In West Virginia was an open seat, but that's obviously a flip as well. And then it looks like they're probably going to pick up Pennsylvania, so that they get one of the battleground states for sure, but maybe not any of the other ones, at least. But we still don't know for sure on three of these races. Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania. But it looks like Democrats are going to take Nevada and Arizona, and Republicans take Pennsylvania. And then the House, right now, Decision Desk HQ, which I think is very reliable, they've called, I think like 216 Republican seats are already called, but they're still haven't gotten quite to the majority yet. And they're projecting a 1 or 2 seat pickup beyond what Republicans already held. So not much change at all, but they're holding. And the key takeaway is you're going to have a Republican trifecta in the federal government, but they're going to be with relatively thin margins in both the Senate and the House. So that's setting the table with all the caveats, I think, that are appropriate. So let's get into what does that mean for gun policy. Why don't we just start off with legislation? What do you see the ability of Republicans to do on guns through legislation in a Congress that they control, but only by thin margins?
Well, on paper, not much, right? If the filibuster stays intact in the Senate, which Mitch McConnell says it will, of course, he's not going to be the Senate Majority Leader, right? But if the filibuster remains intact, let's say Dave McCormick is declared the winner. Ruben Gallego is the winner in Arizona. Jackie Rosen is the winner in Nevada. You're looking at 53 Republican seats, right? So for any pro-gun legislation to pass, you need to get 7 Democrat senators to sign on.
It's a lot.
That's going to be a chore, right? And I don't necessarily think it's possible to get 7 Democrats to sign on to pro-gun legislation. So, I don't know that we're going to see anything actually get to Trump's desk if the filibuster, remains in place. And, over the House side, I think you will see things like, I think we've got a good shot at passing national right to carry reciprocity. Pretty good shot, I think, at passing the Hearing Protection Act. Although, I'm not even sure about that. I've got a piece coming up this weekend at Bearing Arms looking at right now, Richard Hudson's Right to Carry Reciprocity Act has 170 co-sponsors. So, you're still 47 votes shy. Now, listen, not you don't have to co-sponsor a bill to vote for it, but that at least indicates that there are, several dozen Republicans who are either on the fence or for whatever reason haven't, wholeheartedly embraced the idea of national right to carry reciprocity. The Hearing Protection Act, I think, has 69 co-sponsors in addition to the original sponsor, Jeff. I think it's Jeff Duncan from South Carolina. So again, this is it's going to be an upward fight, I think, for gun owners to get some of these priorities through Congress. And, one of the other things that I'm kind of keying in on here is that even with Republicans in control, let's say we've got a Republican trifecta, gun owners are still going to have to lobby to be heard. Gun owners are still going to have to lobby to say, hey, pay attention to these issues here, right? I mean, you can go and you can look at the 2024 Republican platform. Very light on, gun issues. Donald Trump didn't talk a lot about gun issues on the campaign trail, right? He said, he said he'd protect the Second Amendment, but he didn't really advance a whole lot of pro-gun policies.
Right.
So
they stripped out a lot of the specific policy promises that had been in the previous platform for the party.
Right.
So
I think the priorities for Republicans going in are going to be, immigration, going to be the economy, again, trying to fundamentally restructure the executive branch and, cabinet agencies and things of that nature. So, I think gun owners and Second Amendment supporters are going to have to fight for a seat at the table, to be quite honest. And otherwise, we may very well get overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, certainly legislatively, I think that makes a lot of sense. I just don't. It's going to be. One, if the margin in the House really is 221, 222 vote majority, it's going to be hard to pass anything. I mean, we've seen how the House has gone with a 220 vote majority, and they can barely even pick a speaker. Maybe they'll skip that fight this time around since they already have a speaker in place that Trump likes and the party seems to be relatively well adjusted to at this point. But, passing any legislation, especially anything remotely controversial. And the thing about the top legislative priorities, the gun rights movement, have been the two things you mentioned for forever now, the national reciprocity and hearing protection. And, national reciprocity, you're going to have pushback from potentially Republicans in blue states, because essentially what national reciprocity says is that those blue states have to honor everyone else's permits. And a lot of people in the blue states don't like that. I mean, more so on the Democratic side, obviously, but you do wonder where some of those blue state Republicans in California and New York, especially New Jersey, are going to come down on that, if they're all going to be okay with it. No, maybe they will. Right. And I wouldn't be surprised if we do see a vote on that at some point, even if it's just kind of symbolic. But, and same thing for Hearing Protection Act, silencer reform, anything dealing with the NFA, as much as that animates online gun rights activists, I don't think it animates a lot of Republican congressmen nearly as much. You certainly have your more hardcore conservative types that care deeply about that issue, but your average Republican congressman, I don't even know that they have any understanding what the NFA is to begin with. And,
right.
It's just
and
a
that's,
hard
I mean, again, I think that's one of the challenges, right? That's why gun owners just can't take anything for granted. Now, even if the filibuster remains intact, there will be some opportunities, I think, to do things through reconciliation, through budget bills. And that actually might be a way to, remove suppressors from the NFA, with just a simple majority. But as you say, right, then the issue becomes, okay, how do you get 51 Republican senators to say, okay, this is what we want to do here. This is something I can explain to my constituents. How do you get 217 Republican House members to say, this is the argument that I can take home to my district in a blue state like California, right? In an election or a district where maybe the Republican won by just a few thousand votes, and the Democrats are going to say, right, this Republican X wants to legalize silencers, right? To make killers and assassins operate, in the shadows. I mean, we know what the argument against this is going to be, right?
And
we know the
Americans
demonization
don't have a good understanding of suppressors and silencers, and they get a lot of their views on it from movies. Even John Wick, famously, a movie that people like the shooting style of John Wick, but even in those movies, silencers are basically treated as magical assassin, assistants. So it's
and
something
so there's
that's
education that has to be done, right? I mean, if you want this to become law, then we have to educate the public on this, and we can't leave it up to the Republican Party to do that education. You can't leave it up to members of Congress to just explain to their constituents. We have to do that work as gun owners and the Second Amendment advocates. We have to put that argument out there, and we have to be willing to have that discussion and that debate, because there is obviously there is going to be pushback to that. So there's some opportunities there. I think it's also going to be interesting to see what happens in Washington, D.C., right? There's, I think, growing concern on the left and maybe in D.C. that Congress is going to either, I don't think the votes are there to repeal the Home Rule Act, but that Congress is going to start exercising far more oversight over D.C. Washingtonian had an article the other day, and one of the guys that they talked to was, I guess he was a former communications director for Vincent Gray, D.C. council member. And he was talking about how, there's probably going to be some horse trading going on. Like Muriel Bowser, the mayor of D.C., really wants to get federal approval to build a new stadium where RFK Stadium stands right now. Yeah. And I think the guy's name was Chris Theus. And he said he could see, Congress saying, okay, well, we need to make some changes to the gun laws in D.C. before we allow you to do something like that. So, I mean, it is possible that, even if you don't get national right to carry reciprocity, maybe you get universal recognition in D.C. Maybe, that might be a demand that Republicans put out there, that if you want us to allow this new stadium to be built, well, we want to make sure that people don't lose their Second Amendment rights when they come to our nation's capital. Right. So, I think there's going to be some interesting opportunities, but I think nothing is guaranteed right now. Yeah. And that last one would be personally ironic for me, because I've now gone out and gotten my DC concealed carry license. I actually haven't even carried in the city since I've gotten it, but just because I don't go in there that often, and where I go, you still can't carry anyway, because there's a lot of restricted areas, gun-free zones in DC, as you could probably imagine, and they don't allow you to carry on Metro. These are things that I do agree could potentially be changed under pressure from a Republican Congress, although we've had Republican Congresses before. We had a Trump-led Republican Congress before, and they didn't get these things through. I do think that I agree with you as far as budget reconciliation, putting things like the Hearing Protection Act or national reciprocity or DC gun law changes into larger deals where they're much smaller pieces of a larger piece of legislation. Those seem more like the realistic ways, if assuming things stay normal. And I know I've talked with in the show before about sort of, it's hard to predict what Trump will do, and he said things and so forth. And we're just sticking with based on how things have gone, how things could go in the future. Because once you get past that, it's hard to predict anything. But
presumably this is where you could make deals, is like in bills that don't require 60 votes, budget reconciliation. That's more like, messing with the ATF's budget or something along those lines, or putting, your pet issue, the old paperclip method, putting it into a must pass bill. That could happen. Those are those kind of realistic ways you could see a Republican Congress within majorities actually do some gun reform. But like you said, I think they are heavy lifts. It's not, with what Congress seems like it's going to be, again, a slim majority. 53 is not bad in the Senate. In recent years, that's, you have to go back to the first Obama administration to get a period where either party had 60 votes or 60 seats. But it's still going to be a hard lift on anything, let alone gun. Now, I will say, we've talked about the filibuster here, and I do think if you get to 54, 55, that's where the odds of eliminating the filibuster go up the more Republican seats there are. I think that's my view. I think that's the reality. Like, Trump has called for it in the past. In 2018, he wanted to get rid of it. And, Democrats have threatened to do the same thing, which gives Republicans perhaps more incentive. They might also be more inclined to listen to Trump now that he's won again and won the popular vote likely this time. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you still have too many establishmentarians, I guess, for the lack of a better word. I don't see Lisa Murkowski going along with nuking the filibuster. I don't see Susan Collins going along with nuking the filibuster.
Right.
I would be surprised if John Cornyn were to do that, or even John Thune. So I don't know that the votes are there. Yeah. I think there's going to be a push for that. I think Trump is going to push for that, right? Because he's going to see it's going to be harder to get his agenda enacted with the filibuster in place. But I don't know that he's going to be able to get every Republican to go along with that. So I'm just operating on the assumption that the filibuster is going to remain in place, because I don't know that there's going to be enough arms to twist to get it removed. And personally, I don't think it should be removed. I like that safeguard. The Senate is supposed to be the chamber that sort of cools the passions of the House. It's not necessarily supposed to be easy to pass legislation. And so even if it means, I don't get what I want legislatively, I think it's an important guardrail to keep in place. And again, I mean, you're right, though. Democrats said, well, I think almost every Democratic Senate candidate said that they were in favor of nuking the filibuster. And that's one of the problems, right? Yeah. I think we need to see some de-escalation on the part of the left. And I think, while the Democrats are doing some soul searching, maybe that's something that they could, navel gaze and take a look at. Okay, did it hurt us when we said we were going to pack the Supreme Court? Did it hurt us when we said we were going to nuke the filibuster? Because there's all this talk about, Trump destroying norms. Mm-hmm. You could make the argument that Democrats were just as willing to destroy those norms. They were just doing it in a way that was acceptable to the mainstream media, that was acceptable to the academic establishment or the political establishment on the left. And again, I think if the Democrats are willing to take a step back from the edge, they'll probably find some Republicans who are willing to go along with them on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are of a similar viewpoint on this stuff. I agree with a lot of what you just said there personally. Democrats didn't nuke the filibuster when they had the opportunity, but that was mainly because they just didn't have the votes for it.
Right. I mean, Manchin and Sinema said they weren't going to do it. And so, again, you didn't have the 51. And I think, Murkowski and Collins are going to serve that same sort of purpose.
Yeah, maybe. And that's the thing about the Senate is like you said, it is kind of a moderating force in our national politics. And these senators do seem to buck their parties sometimes on these sorts of institutional questions, like should we drastically change how the Senate works, which is what would happen if you nuke the filibuster. But I do still think the larger the Republican majority is, the more likely it becomes, just like the other way, the larger a Democrat majority in a Democrat trifecta, the more likely it becomes that the filibuster goes away or is reformed in some way. I think Trump, when he proposed it, it was there's been talk about going back to a literal talking filibuster, like in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is starting to become a very dated reference, I think, in 2024 America.
Right.
But the people who are in the Senate and who have become president, that's what they grew up watching, and it is American classic, to be fair. But yeah, so I just that's the kind of the one area that changed with the outcome. Although again, it does feel like we're maybe going to get to 53 and not 55. So you're still certainly Murkowski and Collins. I think it'd be very hard to get them on board, and I'm sure there's at least one or two more Republican senators who probably wouldn't go.
Well, I mean, McConnell is going to be there, right? He's not retiring right away. He's just not running for reelection. So, McConnell would be there. I think Grassley as an institutionalist, like I said, I think John Cornyn. Yeah. I don't think they've got 51 votes to get rid of the filibuster rule. I think that's accurate. So with that in mind and where the legislative angle seems to be at now that we have some pretty good idea of what the makeup of the government is going to be, let's move on to where, we think the most likely big movements can happen on gun policy in a Trump administration. And I would imagine, first off, judicial appointments, which is another area where the Senate majority will matter to some degree. Although I think Republicans are probably a little bit less divided on that, the kinds of judges that Trump, at least in his first term, was appointing, right? Yeah, I think that's accurate. And it's interesting. I mean, I've seen since the election, there has been this push on the left to try to pressure Sonia Sotomayor to step down, right? Yeah. To not pull a Ruth Bader Ginsburg and stick around, and then give Trump an opportunity to appoint her replacement. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think she's going to step down.
I don't know that they have time.
And then, of course, the latest theory was that Joe Biden should appoint Kamala Harris. Yes, which I really don't see happening. Right. No, in fact, I don't think there's any guarantee that if Sotomayor did step down, Democrats could get a replacement confirmed. They might end up just giving Trump the opportunity to appoint somebody on day one.
It'd be a huge risk. Yeah.
Yeah. But, you're right. And it's not just Supreme Court nominees, right? I mean, there is going to be, I think, that same push on the right, maybe not right away, but listen, 2 years from now, maybe before the 26 elections, you'll start hearing more people talk about, okay, Clarence Thomas, you've done a great job for us, but it's probably time for you to go back to your RV and drive around the country and enjoy yourself, right? Sam Alito, same thing.
You have seen, there actually has been a little bit of chatter on that front already, basically.
Yeah, there has been a little bit.
Leonard Leo of who was the head of the Federalist Society, very important figure as far as the conservative judicial movement in the United States, has already come out and chastised some people for going there already. But I think it's hard to imagine that somebody like Thomas and Alito, who, especially Alito, just frankly, I think everyone on the Supreme Court is very aware of the ideological balance on the Supreme Court. But those guys, I think, are not willing to stick it out and risk changing that balance. So, and I don't think they seem fairly favorable to Donald Trump. So I don't think they'd be unhappy with him. Like Roberts, I don't know what Roberts thinks about Donald Trump necessarily and whether he wants him to replace him or whatever. But I think those two guys who are the oldest probably be willing to step down and be replaced.
I don't think Roberts feels like it's time for him to go.
He's not.
I think Roberts feels like he could probably do that job for quite a while.
Yeah. And Sotomayor would be the third oldest, I think.
Yeah.
Which is why there's chatter about her right now.
She's 70. She's apparently not in great health. She, I guess, travels with a team of medical professionals. So, and then again, Democrats, I think, have PTSD over Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Sure. So
just like Republicans, I can understand why Scalia.
Right.
That worked out in their favor, but it wasn't when he passed away, everyone was very concerned.
Yeah. But then you look at those lower court judges too. I mean, that's hugely important, right? Mm-hmm. Trump appointed 230 some odd judges. I think Biden has appointed 211.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing that the Democrats are saying, just Biden just needs to do nothing but appoint judges between, now and the time he steps down.
Probably.
So we did see, ideological balance on the Ninth Circuit, for instance, for the first time in decades. I mean, the Ninth Circuit went more than 50 cases where they upheld gun control laws, right? They had a gun rights activists had a losing streak of, more than 50 lawsuits where the Ninth Circuit said, yeah, that gun law is fine, that gun law is fine, that gun law is fine. And over the last couple of years of the Trump administration, and even during some of the Biden administration, because of Trump's appointments, we started to see 3-judge panels on the Ninth Circuit say, this gun law, no, this violates the Second Amendment. They didn't have those en banc reviews that would overturn those decisions. I think we actually did get a good decision in the Boland case, right? The case dealing with California's handgun roster. Got a good decision from the 3-judge panel, and the Ninth Circuit did not take that case en banc. So that is, I think, a significant win for gun owners, right? But that's going to be a huge part, I think, of Trump's second term is, shaping the judiciary, not just at the Supreme Court level, but at the district court level and at the appellate court level, too.
Yeah, I just think that's probably the biggest thing. That's from a gun rights point of view, that's the brightest part of his first term record for easily. And it will probably be the brightest part of his second term record unless he radically changes his point of view on who he's picking to, put up for judges. But there's no sign that he's going to do that. And I think part of it is it has the longest lasting impact, right? Yeah. I expect that Trump's going to undo Biden's executive actions. Right.
If Trump, fires Steve Dettelbach as ATF director and replaces him with somebody else, the next time a Democrat comes in, Trump's appointment is going to get fired. Right. So, but these judges are going to be there, a lot of cases, 20, 30 years or more. So I think just by the very nature of the longevity of those decisions, that makes his judicial appointments the most important thing that he can do.
And that's what makes the Republican majority in the Senate, whatever the number ends up being, also much more important on this front as well, because this is, and this is another reason why it's less like, as much as Trump is a wild card, and we'll get into some of that, Trump wild card, his nature on this front, perhaps in a bit here, but this is one area where, despite the divisions on the right that have existed since Trump, came up, they're obviously much less so now. There are just fewer anti-Trump people on the right than there were in 2016 or throughout his first term. But even those who are more Trump skeptical, this was an area where I think most people on the political right in the United States were pretty happy, and it went pretty smoothly getting those judges through. It wasn't something where he had a lot of friction with even the Trump skeptical Republican senators that existed. This is just something where there isn't any sort of great reason for him to reverse course on how he's handled appointing judges. He's largely left it to, the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo and people who have dedicated their lives to that sort of thing. And that's made, I think, everybody, for the most part, in the Republican Party pretty happy. So I kind of would expect that to continue, right? It'll be the most consequential and probably the most likely to be closest to what he did the first term as well.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So speaking of the executive action stuff, though, this is the other area where there's the potential for a lot more impact. And I think this is also one where you maybe question how far it's going to go. But as you mentioned, he can fire the ATF director. Biden kind of politicized that position, right? Just to be
very much so. Just
to be objective, like he tried to appoint Chipman, who was literally a gun control group spokesperson at the time. He had been an ATF agent before that. That didn't go through, but even Dettelbach, the current director, was somebody who ran as a Democrat for Attorney General of Ohio, while he also, he wasn't a U.S. attorney as well, but he was somebody who took strong gun control positions during his political phase and didn't come from the ATF or anything like that. So he definitely opened the door to more politicization of that position than perhaps he previously been. And Trump has already promised, as much as he hasn't talked a lot of detail on policy. He did early on in the campaign when he spoke to the NRA, promised to fire Dettelbach on day one. Well, I don't know if it'll be exactly day one, but it'll probably happen early on. And then he's going to have an opportunity to, and then of course, in addition to that, he also promised to basically undo all of the executive orders and federal rulemaking that Biden has put in place during his administration. And those are things where he certainly has the power to do all that, right? And he certainly has the power to then appoint his own ATF director and try to make his own rules. But I guess this is where I start to wonder how much of that he'll actually do, because if you look back to the first administration, he tried to appoint a permanent director of the ATF, but that nominee got torpedoed by his own party, by Ted Cruz. Actually, was the one who was strongly questioning him during his confirmation hearing, and he didn't get through. And then he left basically acting directors to run the agency during that time. And additionally, with rulemaking, his biggest rule was the bump stock ban, which got struck down later as unlawful by the Supreme Court. But, I don't know. What do you see for this second administration?
So I think you will see him undo the Biden executive actions because that is pretty easy to do, right? And in the waning days of the Trump administration,
do you think that'll require additional rulemaking? Because all that stuff went through the rulemaking process, which takes a year at least.
Yeah.
Do you know? I'm not sure if that's going to take a year to undo through rulemaking, or if there's some other way he can get at it. Do we have any insight on that?
I'm guessing even if there is a formal rulemaking process that has to be done to rescind these things that have gone through that process and are in place, I'm pretty sure that Trump can direct the whoever the ATF director is or whoever the attorney general is and say, listen, we're not going to make this a priority, right? We're not going to actively enforce these particular provisions, right? And the DOJ could issue guidance, for example, on the engaged in the business rule, and they could go back and say, listen, the language of the statute says you have to repetitively buy and sell firearms, so we're not going to use this interpretation. We're going to go by the text of the statute. I think there are probably ways to game that out, right? One of the things I'm interested to see, and again, I hope it's a day one decision, is closing the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, which has become this sort of jobs program for the gun control lobby. That
you want to see it
needs to go away.
Instead of I don't know, reshaped in some other way. You think it just close it?
I don't think. So I would like to see it maybe replaced with something. And I wouldn't call it the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. Maybe if it's the White House Office of Violence Prevention, maybe it's the White House Office of to promote responsible gun ownership or something like that. But with a focus on reducing violent crime, reducing suicide, but not reducing lawful gun ownership, not trying to reduce violent crime or suicide by going after lawful gun owners. That's something that I think Trump could do pretty easily. There was a rule that he started to put in place in the waning days of his administration that was based on, I think it was a response to Operation Choke Point, which was, the FDIC basically going after
disfavored
banks and telling them, hey, if you're doing business, with gun companies or in these areas, you're opening yourself up to all sorts of institutional risks, and we might go into your, to your books and see what's going on.
Right.
That I think could be revised and revived, and we could see that rule put back in place. As we're talking, by the way, Stephen, I think Judge McGlynn has issued his decision in the Illinois cases. So,
oh really?
And has issued a permanent injunction enjoining the state from enforcing the Protect Illinois Communities Act criminal penalties against Illinois citizens. So there is that little bit of breaking news for you and I. I know it won't be breaking news by the time the podcast goes up, but
there you go.
Yeah. So
but, that's another area. But I guess as far as the rules go, I guess the broader question that I'm interested in, at least at the moment, right? Because it's hard to game these things out before we know who's even going to be in the administration and stuff like that. But the first time around, he didn't, other than the very end with the rule that didn't go into effect that you're talking about here, there wasn't a lot of movement to try and play in the gray areas of federal gun law in sort of a pro-gun direction. Biden went very aggressively to trying to use the gray areas to enact more restrictions. In theory, Trump could do the opposite of that. But he hasn't really promised that. He's just kind of more. The vibe to me is always kind of been, I'm going to not do more gun control, aren't you? Right? That's kind of been his big promise. They're going to take your guns. I'm going to not let them do that. And then not a lot of detail about beyond that. And I just wonder how that plays out.
Well, I do too. And I think it is an open question. But, I think J.D. Vance is a individual who he understands the importance of the Second Amendment. He has talked about that quite a bit, even before he was named the vice presidential candidate.
Right.
And so, Kamala Harris was sort of, gun control was basically her portfolio too, right? She was ostensibly in charge of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. So if Vance serves that same role, but in a pro-Second Amendment perspective, then maybe you will have a more active executive branch that is willing to take go on offense, right? And maybe interpret ATF regulations in a way that benefits gun owners as opposed to penalizes gun owners. But I think it is an open question, right? I think we just don't know what the second term of Trump's presidency is going to look like, right? And how he's going to govern, how much delegation he's going to do to cabinet secretaries or to the vice president. But I suspect that there's some room for him to operate within the executive branch, not just undoing what happened over the last 4 years, but actually, moving forward a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of room if you had the right people in there. The question is, do they take a more aggressive ideological approach like Biden did with his administration on federal law enforcement in regards to firearms, or do they go back to the first term approach of kind of, letting acting directors focus on letting law enforcement people who've been in the ATF forever kind of, run the show and not make a lot of noise one way or the other, and just go back to sort of business as normal pre-2020. That's what I would wonder. And you're right, like Vance, it's a good example. If he takes an active role with his point of view, at least how he's articulated since becoming a politician, he is much more in the I want to actively do things for the gun rights movement rather than just the more shield nature of how Trump presents his views. So, and I guess that's what we'll have to find out. Like, we'll have to see who they stock the administration with, who they perhaps try to replace Dettelbach, if they even do fire Dettelbach. I mean, the thing about Trump is he is a wild card. He says stuff. He doesn't always do everything he says or do it in the way that he says. And sometimes he can, reconcile with people that he's previously fighting with. He has, of course, fired top ranking federal law enforcement. He fired Comey, obviously. The FBI. It's not something he couldn't do or might not do, but it's just hard to say.
I would be really surprised if he kept Dettelbach on, to be honest. I mean, not only has he publicly said that he would fire Dettelbach, but I don't think he wants any holdovers from the Biden administration.
Yeah,
particularly
I think he really doesn't
like
the Biden administration and anything associated with it. It's the vibe that I get right from how he talks about it. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he follows through and gets rid of basically everything they did on guns, including appointing Dettelbach. But then the key question is, like, what comes after that? Will there be a follow-up that pushes things the other way, or is it just going to be go back to how it was before Biden? And I'm kind of not paying attention to this area very much. And then I guess the last wild card thing is that I mentioned in my piece, and I'd be interested in your reaction to, is one under discussed or appreciated aspect of Donald Trump's first term on guns is, at least among gun rights activists, tends to be his willingness to or openness to crafting some sort of gun deal with Democrats in the immediate aftermaths of major mass shootings. We saw reporting that in El Paso, after the El Paso shooting, that he had considered backing an assault ban, but was ultimately talked out of doing that. And then, of course, after Parkland, he made the infamous comments of take the guns first, due process second, in a roundtable meeting with lawmakers where he was very much more aligned with the Democrats than the Republicans in the room. Now, that also didn't come to fruition. And the reason that didn't come to fruition may be a reason to think that kind of stuff might not happen this time around, which is that the first impeachment happened shortly after that meeting. And so legislation, this bipartisan deal, never materialized. And I don't know if he's going to be willing to do any of that kind of stuff with Democrats this time around, given how much their relationship has soured since then. I mean, it's hard to predict what it's going to be like, but I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, not only is the relationship, I think, going to be much more combative this time around, but, Trump is a one and done president at this point, right? He comes in, he can't run for re-election again. So he doesn't necessarily have to worry about triangulating and, what's this going to mean for my re-election bid? So I suspect that it's going to be less likely to try to even, float out those ideas. I mean, I do think he likes to be a deal maker, right?
Yeah.
He does like to make those deals. We have seen on issues like abortion that he's willing to buck with the Republican establishment and say, you know what, let's leave it up to the states. I'm not in favor of a total abortion ban. Of course, he appointed the justices that, gave us the Dobbs decision, right? So, but he has not at least gone as far as some Republicans would like to see him go on abortion and pro-life issues. So it's possible that, at some point over the next 4 years, he says, he decides, okay, I want to make some sort of grand bargain. And I don't think that there's going to be a majority of Republicans who are willing to go along with that.
That's interesting.
I suspect that his cabinet officials, we don't know who they're going to be, but I suspect that they also would be inclined to try to talk him down. And then, of course, you're going to have, I hope that you're going to have a seat at the table for Second Amendment organizations who would, be able to at least, whisper into his ear and say, hey, this is not the right move if you want to help Republicans going forward. So it's not a huge concern of mine.
Look, I don't think it's a extremely likely outcome. I just think it's a bit of an underrated one because the potential for Donald Trump to move Republicans, I think, is much greater than, say, if you had a Harris administration and a Republican Congress. Now, yes, the counter to that is that Biden did pass a gun control bill with substantial Republican support, but it was a much more modest package than like the red flag proposal that Trump had verbally backed, at least during it. My thought is just with the influence that Donald Trump has on the Republican Party, and also like you bring up the Second Amendment groups and their influence, and looking around, the NRA sure seems like it has much less influence over him than it did the first time. There just isn't that same sort of relationship. He canceled their event together the last week of the election. They're not in the same standing that they were in the first of Trump administration. So those are the things that here's the under considered perhaps downside that might materialize. But again, like you said, not necessarily something that is the most likely outcome. It's just something that comes to mind for me that hasn't really been discussed much. And, it's because I think the likelihood of pro-gun legislation certainly is higher under a Republican trifecta, even with the filibuster, than under divided government with Harris as president. But I also do think there's a slightly more potential for some sort of gun control legislation in that setup as well, because Republicans are more likely to go along with Trump than Harris on something like that. It had to be a very specific moment, like Parkland was. But just a thought. These are all early thoughts, right? We're just giving you the preliminary reactions here. But that was one of the ones that came to mind for me. So I think we've covered everything. Is there anything else that you're looking at this trifecta, the margins that exist, and as far as gun policy goes that you're seeing?
The only other thing that I would mention is DOJ, right? Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice has taken this very unlimited position when it comes to like prohibited persons, right? And basically, their attitude is if you were convicted of a serious crime, however Congress defines serious crime, you lose your Second Amendment rights forever. Will we see, the next Attorney General continue to follow that line of thinking, and to say someone like Brian Range, who was convicted of a nonviolent misdemeanor, I think pled guilty to a nonviolent misdemeanor 30 years ago, someone like him should be deprived of their Second Amendment rights? Patrick Darnell Daniels, who got 46 months in federal prison because he admitted to smoking marijuana 14 times a month while he owned a gun. Will those be the types of, statutes that the Trump administration continues to defend? Or will we see, Trump's attorney general take this position of, okay, no, we need to have dangerousness as the standard, right? We shouldn't just have a blanket rule. Considering Trump was convicted of 34 felonies, has not yet been sentenced, so he is not yet a prohibited person. But, that might give Trump a little bit of a unique perspective into this issue, right? So I think that's the only other area there is how DOJ will enforce some of these laws that are on the books and what arguments they'll use when these laws are challenged in court. Yeah,
actually, I think that's a really good insight on 2 points. One, actually, he is already a prohibited person, even though he hasn't been sentenced. But maybe that gives him, like you said, a different point of view on our federal gun laws, because he's been impacted directly by them in ways that he clearly believes are very unfair. And so I don't know if maybe that'll extend to how he wants his DOJ to argue these cases that they're in theory obliged to defend, but in practice they don't necessarily have to they certainly don't have to make the same arguments that Biden's DOJ has made. Because you're alluding to the argument they made in the Rahimi case, which was that basically you have to be responsible, and that the Congress can kind of make any crime that they want indicate that you're not responsible. And so maybe the Trump DOJ, with whoever becomes the Attorney General, will have a much more pro-gun view of things, and they'll have a different position on these dangerousness cases that we're looking at, like you mentioned, the Range and Daniels, and that, I think that's a very good point. And I do wonder how that'll shake things out. You had a good piece on this, and you mentioned, of course, that even if the DOJ does that, doesn't necessarily mean those cases go away. They can still be defended by other outside groups, right? But it would be a significant shift, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So buckle up. It's going to be an interesting 4 years.
That I think is everyone can agree on. It's going to be, I don't know what's going to happen. We'll all find out together. But on this front, I think we at least gave some people some good insight on what's likely on gun policy, that's our job, right? For both of us. Speaking
Absolutely.
of which, people want to read more of your work on this front. Where can they do that?
Just go to bearingarms.com. That's where I'll be headed as soon as we get done here, because I've got to do my write-up on Judge McGlynn's decision about the gun and magazine ban in Illinois. In fact, I need to go read that decision. But bearingarms.com. You can find Cam and Company there, and, of course, all of our Second Amendment reporting. And, Stephen, got to have you back on Cam and Company here in the very near future. But thank you again for the invite. I always love coming on the podcast.
Yeah, always love having you. Appreciate your insights, and I think our audience appreciates them as well. So that's all we've got for this episode. I'm going to toss it over to myself for our last dispatch ad swap. So enjoy it and make sure you take advantage of the discount code while you still can. But that's all we've got for you this week. I'll hand it off to myself. This week, we're doing another ad swap with the Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at the Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, the Dispatch has, in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of. Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Alla Pundit. And there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time, and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts-first reporting, on hard news, in the same way that we do here at the Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. Been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to the Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.